Whenever Fire Emblem crosses my mind, I think back to being 9 and playing it on the Game Boy Advance. I had the dark purple one, and I remember playing it so much that the R button on the thing basically didn't work anymore. It was the original model too, like not the newfangled backlit SP, so I still had to, on the many nights that I stayed up way too late, use a nightlight to see it. I played FE7 like a monster, on hardware, arena and boss abusing my favorite characters to max levels, 2020s all of them, but the thing that sticks out to me more than anything was Lynn's story. So she finds you passed out on the plains of Sakai, and she takes you into a home that only she lives in, the sole survivor who gets beset by bandits. You help her out, she scores a scripted critical hit on the boss. It's the coolest thing I've ever seen on a GBA, and this entire time, I feel like I know this girl. Like, she talks the way my brain wants to read her. Tough and confident and sweet to her friends. There's a maturity to her character. Perhaps it's only something I imbue into her, but it makes her journey have a texture to it. A structure that hooks me enough that I even kind of forgave the game relegating her into a side character for the rest of the game. FE7, as the cool kids on Nintendo Power Forums call it when they aren't calling it Rekka no Ken, inhabits such a specific part of my brain that it is the core of my tension with this series. It is on some level hard for me to decouple the specific feelings I had as a kid about these games, the way I imbued them with my own meta-narrative meaning. So there is some tiny part of me that looks at most modern Fire Emblem with a small sense of longing for the games of my youth. Nostalgia, what a concept. So a lot of people like specific parts of the newest game in the series, Fire Emblem Engage, mostly the gameplay elements, and mostly dismiss the game's story as a meme, and that construct has troubled the process of writing this video for months now. It's hard to isolate the specific flaws in the game's writing when I feel like there's a lot of energy towards dismissing the story out of hand, and it's important to note that a lot of the reasons given don't work for me. People don't like the campy aesthetics, the almost parodic melodrama. They point to plot points and the sheer function of fusing with famous protagonists from the series prior, Tokyo Mirage Sessions style, goddamn, as proof that the game is goofy and there's not really a point in engaging with the story. Now, a good number of folks in this camp also come around to say that the story ends up being pretty good anyway, and that, well, we'll get there. I do earnestly want to talk about this game's story issues, but it's not the kind of problem I can just open with, and worst of all is the kind of weird strain in working on this project at all. Besides my IRL life going really well, I promise, pushing myself to play Engage and then play it all over again for footage right after, and then write this video right after a very emotionally taxing video 1 month prior, a decision that replaced a much more passionate video I was going to make that's now going to have to wait until 2024 if I live that long, to now be here, staring at this problem so long that I feel like I'm going insane, asking myself such cool and healthy questions like, what do I even like about Fire Emblem in the first place? And do I even like anything in my life at all, really? Or am I just being perpetually inconvenienced from quietly wishing for oblivion? So, Emblem Engage. One of the immediate points of conflict going into this project is that a lot of FE fans do not seem to be fans of the game's camp, or they do and get really weird about it. Engage is pretty campy. The main character has hair so ridiculous that an early leak of the game led to the entire fandom basically immediately writing the leak off as fake. You fuse with emblems, which are pseudo-incorporeal like protagonists of the Fire Emblem of Eld and Sigurd. At one point, you yourself become the 13th emblem, the Fire Emblem. Like, camp is everywhere. That's fine, though. It's okay to have this game coming in with a kind of wild, vibrant aesthetic lightheartedness. It actually does a lot to set the game's identity really neatly in the series, that had an early history of games that kind of all look like each other in their respective eras up until they decided to get real funky with it starting from Awakening onwards. There is, however, this kind of bizarre tendency to use the game's visual style and say that the game doesn't want you to take its story seriously, and that's the kind of flaw that is, one, very indicative of a community that legitimately had a crisis point about whether or not a character was a fascist because of her armor, and two, kind of an incurious assessment of the game's intent. So there are definitely moments in this game where it tips its high melodrama into an almost parody-like state, particularly after, I want to say, like, 4, maybe, death scenes with characters that take well over 5 minutes of them talking about things with their dying breaths. But I think what people are honing in on here is naive camp, as defined by a ContraPoints video that resulted in her relapsing into drinking, I think. The internet's really healthy. But the basic idea is that I don't think Engage is playing itself as a parody. It's a little too earnest in its emotional language to call it a parody of Fire Emblem or melodramatic fantasy at all. The voice direction alone, I think, proves this. The VAs who, shoutouts to Patrick Seitz. He's been the voice director for every FE project since Shadows of Valentia, I think, and he's crushing it every time. It's not insincere, and that in itself can be endearing. That's the heart of Naive Camp. That's watching art either too unaware of or unashamed of its own silliness to do anything to try and lampshade or offset it. You are going to watch Lumera have 2 long, drawn-out, heartfelt goodbyes. That's just part of the game. There is a problem here, though, and we will get to it. I just wanted to push back on some of the more common talking points I've seen in the discourse around Engage. Talking about the story in any Fire Emblem can be a tricky ordeal, because there's kind of a fine line to it. On one hand, outright dismissing the story because no one cares is upsetting, since, yes, obviously people do care beyond just me. People are hired to write these games, and no one in it for a paycheck and nothing else would write games like these. These are completely unhinged ways to tell stories. On the other hand, though, is that there are a lot of things that this game say, intentionally or otherwise, that if you obsess over, gets you stuck in Fire Emblem hell. On some level, you're going to have to concede that these games are often about royal teens restoring their country, because it's a pretty quick and easy way to make a character take motivated action in a narrative when their actions don't just affect them, but an entire country of people. So, pulling back the argument that the game's silliness means he shouldn't care, what do we have underneath? Why am I torturing myself over obsessing over this game that I have fun with when I'm not thinking about it in the context of the rest of the series? Is it just that I'm perpetually annoyed about the paralogs where every main character from other games give the most generic ways of talking about the problems they're facing in their own stories? I mean, maybe not specifically that, but... So, I've been dancing around the heart of the problem here for a while, and I am sorry about that, but I want to cover my bases here when I go in on the exact way that Engage's writing is bad. It's not bad because of the melodrama, or the lighter tone, or the goofy characters. Okay, a little bit because of the goofy characters, but that's like a personal gripe. Or the protracted death scenes. But in a sudden shock twist, most of Engage's writing problems are the same problems shared by 2 other games you may have heard of, called Fire Emblem Fates and Fire Emblem Three Houses. Wow. Now, at first, that might sound ridiculous, because Fates and Three Houses, as we all know, are games that have a pretty clear problem of wanting to tell kind of a darker story, where you lose people and make rough choices that split the path of the game, and they fall apart under the weight of their ambitions. I'm sure everyone thinks this. So a game that has a much simpler, cleaner, easier story like Engage shouldn't have this problem. These games, narratively speaking, are kind of diametrically opposed, right? Well, not as much as you may think. Besides a couple of weird similarities that makes Engage feel like a redo of Fates, but it's one path, you have to fight your zombie mother, and you're fighting your family that's gone evil, and you hurt a precious bean sister that's close to you. You die in both games and come back with a bigger power after being gently affirmed by an also dead family member. The problems are a little more structural. So the best way to look at structure in this game's writing is to look at Zephia's death. Zephia is a recurring enemy that you fight a comical amount of times. The Four Hounds hound your progress pretty regularly from the mid-game. Fuck the pun. The Four Hounds hound your progress pretty regularly from the mid-game onto way, way late into the game. And in the final moment, Zephia gives you a special crystal to help you stop Sombron, and then spends the next 12 years talking to Gris about why she did this, and why she was ready to die for Sombron to only help them now after she's dying, and she goes into her backstory. Here, it's a fine enough backstory. It's something that by itself makes sense. You can look back at how she talked about the other hounds, and no, she actually will just tell you. That's why she called them a family. She wanted to have kids of her own. You see, this is the problem in a nutshell. I've seen some high-profile folks in the fandom say that in the back half of the game, the writing suddenly gets really good, and I disagree. I think that it is here, in the back half of the game, that you can see the problem in the game's writing clearly. What I think people mean when they say that the writing suddenly gets good and Engage's later half is that the later half gives you interesting things about the game here and now. A lot of wild things happen, Okay, so like Alir dies, right? In chapter 21, you take a hit for your sister and you die, and your sister's good half dies too. It's complicated, we'll get to it. So you and her in the afterlife, and she comes back and raises you as a zombie, and now Alir can only summon the bad versions of the emblems, and it's kind of interesting, like, it's an interesting thing to throw at you. Like, now you have to deal with the weird way that the Fel emblems work, and your character's name has even changed, and it's kind of a neat way of changing things up. And then at the end of that chapter, it's done, and you're back to normal, but also you're an emblem, the Fire Emblem. So let's pick this apart a little more clearly. There are two really good ideas here. Alir has an established fear and revulsion of the corrupted, which are the zombie enemies that you fight, and now they're turned into one in order to keep fighting. On the other hand, Alir becoming an emblem is symbolically a poignant move for this character. Alir's progression is awakening as the Divine Dragon at the start of the game, learning in a 10-minute cutscene that they're actually the child of the Fel Dragon, but have been imbued with some of the Divine Dragon's power, that you're not a real Divine Dragon. So this character's growth has to come not from their birth, but their convictions and actions. It's a good arc to set up that should culminate in them turning into an emblem, which would be consistent with every other emblem in the game. Don't look at the DLC emblems. Marth, Celica, Micaiah, Lynn, these aren't characters that are purely divine on an inherent level. Byleth is, kind of, but characters burdened with a grim journey that they've prevailed through. And Sigurd. Their actions have been preserved as emblems, and a story that ends with Alir joining them as one, not as a divine or a Fel Dragon, but a symbol of this world's conflict coming to an end, is a good one. These two ideas come together horribly. So, okay, emblems. We learned some things about emblems, that they kind of have these weird half-lives. They're alive with the memories of their journeys, they can fight with you in battle and fuse with you to give you greater power, but are otherwise timeless, incorporeal-ish beings. It's not a bad idea, honestly. It kind of imbues these characters with a little bit of melancholy. They're powerful, but bound to the wishes of those who summon them. They're easily corrupted, lost. It's kind of a weird, ephemeral kind of power and importance. It's good, but it's not the kind of thing you can give to your main character unless you do something completely wild and literally turn them into a ring and now you have to use someone else to go fishing with. It's why it'd be a really powerful end to the game's story, but it happens here with like 6-ish chapters still to go, and so you're just both? Like, you're an emblem, but you also have a real body for no reason, because they wanted to make it a game mechanic, I guess. But it eats the idea of Alir going through a meaningful struggle by being corrupted. You're introduced to a mechanic you have to work around only once, and then it's just gone. And you're given this new form of engaging, and that's fine and cool, but the story breaks itself apart just shrugging its shoulders and hoping you don't care enough that the big reveal at the end of the game, when you turn into an emblem and stop Sombron, is just something we know is going to happen from like six-ish chapters ago. I think it might actually be 5. Let's break this down almost chapter by chapter, okay? We learn that Vale has an evil alter ego, even though it's been obvious because her eyes literally go red, in chapter 17. You arrive in Elucia's castle in chapter 20, where it's revealed that you're actually the Fel Dragon, a plot point that's addressed, labored over for an extended cutscene where you lament not being a real Divine Dragon, and then Vander and Sigurd and the Friendship Gang, I'm sorry, each representative from each country is just kind of here in this game, Golden Sun style, to just kind of like say a one-liner at every plot point. They're fun enough characters in their moments in the spotlight and in support combos, but they're mostly just set dressing here, and the plot point's just resolved by the end. And then you go into chapter 21, die, become zombie in chapter 22, and then the end of that is the Emblem Ascension. The chapter after that is a sudden exposition on Zephyia, all, again, contained in one end of chapter cutscene. Then you fight past you, introducing and resolving time travel, bringing up that you fought yourself, putting you in a position to be taken in by Lumera in, again, one big cutscene. Then you fight Zombie Mom, which, like, yeah, I like that chapter in Revelation, fine enough, I guess. Then it's the final chapter where there, you finally learn about Sombron's backstory in one giant, long, pre- and post-battle cutscene. This is the kind of basic structural issue that I find so distressing in this game. People will claim that the back half of the game is good, but all we get here is the rough draft ideas of a better version of this game kind of just stuffed into giant cutscene hell, desperately trying to tell you all the cool things they were definitely going to get to, but Insys was upset that this game's production was taking too long, so they had to cut their losses and go. Let's take the best sequence in Engage, the famous chapter 10-11 sequence, where you fight one map, get all your emblem rings stolen, and your thing that you used to turn back time. You suddenly have to get away from a bunch of murder-death monsters without any of your cozy toys. It's cited in a lot of games' critical reception as an exceptionally strong moment of the game, and a useful one at that, to ensure that the game makes you work with every ring in order to get a good sense of how they all work. I don't know, it's a good moment, good mechanically, well done. There's kind of a problem of tone here, though. It's a moment that I think is trying to be at least a little evocative of that moment in Thracia I liked so much. I made a video about it, but it's kind of a perfectly engineered moment of depriving you of something that you know you're going to get back, and one that doesn't actually remove the heart of the game. When Leaf is kidnapped, you lose all your cool gear that you didn't bring with you on Leaf or Lithis. You lose Avel for the rest of the game unless you enter Punishment Hell, and you're stuck working through the dark with an army made of, like, tissue paper and armed with positive thinking. And even when you get everything back, Thracia never lets you feel like you're back in control of this game like you were in those opening chapters. Engage does the polished, pleasant, gentle version of this. Sure, you lose some real gems like Sigurd and Celica, and definitely Roy. Roy is good, please don't write a comment about Roy. But in that same chapter, you gain 3 units, you get your crystal back before you even end the chapter that you lose it, and you gain 2 new rings, one of which is Lynn, and her ring is... Like, I'm not going to weigh in on how good it is, but it's definitely fun and has a lot of cool things it can do, and then you go back to your little private island home. You can fish and ride a wyvern and pet your puppy cat, and then the game never really has the courage to commit something like that ever again. Even the Chapter 21-22 stuff we talked about, the other big time the game wanted to change things up, was contained entirely in that one chapter. This is kind of what I mean about this game's kind of weird fear about upsetting things too much. It gives you the idea that there will be moments where the game will twist and turn and pull the rug out from under you, but these ideas culminate in ways that have to preserve the gameplay loop as established. It's the exact problem I had with the Monastery in 3 Houses, and while the Somniel isn't as intensive, the heart of the issue is still there. It's a fine enough thing to have in your game, but it seems to hamper any capacity to really make the interesting choices that Engage, 3 Houses, even Fates wanted you to make, and then just can't. You can't have the kind of stakes and changes that would really elevate the events of these games when they're constructed to give you a consistent means to avoid them. You can't have Alir die from more than a cutscene. You can't have Emblem Alir operate the same way as the others. You can't really deal a meaningful blow to your army without making sure that it's something that you can survive enough to keep coming back home. Let's pull back to talk about a different game for a second. Let's talk about Final Fantasy XV. Now, I have many, many opinions about FF15, some positive, some pretty harsh, but the construction of the game is pretty easy to digest early on. Noctis and his boyfriends Gladio, Ignis, and Prompto drive around the country in a cool car, doing odd jobs and taking in the vibes along the way of, like, chipping through the main plot, finding icons, eidolons, summon spirits, and fancy ancient king weapons. The place has many town hubs, pit stops, camping locals, you gather stuff to craft magic, cook with, you can fish. The game has a pretty consistent gameplay loop built around going out to explore and quest, and then coming back to town to rest up and level up, eat, take a photo. It's all well and good, and the kind of gameplay loop that's pretty hard to break. You need all of these things. This is how you grind, this is how you level up your party, this is how you collect stuff, get new gear, and so on. Then you go to the city of Altisia. It seems like a momentous enough deal, like moving to a new open world, and it's a kind of big, a little confusing city, not nearly as big as your open worlds, but it seems like a great little new hub to coordinate around your big open world sandbox, right? No. Instead, Leviathan is summoned, Lunafreya fucking dies, Ignis is blinded for the rest of the game, sort of, the final chapter is very weird and bad, and you're pulled along to another bespoke little area where you do like a little quest and you move on. This is what the game looks like now. Those open worlds, gone. You have a party member that can barely fight. You lose another party member like right after that. You lose your car, your gear, you're left alone sneaking around in the dark for your life, and... okay, you can go back, but it breaks the continuity of the game to do so, like, explicitly, diegetically. You can time travel back to those open worlds via dogs, but it's just that. It's a mechanical way to go back and salvage yourself, gear up, whatever it is you need, but the reality of the story has stripped your comforts, your gameplay loop entirely out of you. Your chef, he's the blind one now. You don't get to really have a real meal anymore, and I believe this is a pretty polarizing element in the community. I was a latecomer to FF15 because I lacked a proper console for it, but I think that's incredible. It feels awful to go through. Like, you're watching the entire story derail itself, and now you're just lost and so deeply and meaningfully hurt by it all. I remember genuinely feeling awful and scared and upset that this game had just busted itself apart in my hands. FF15 has other problems, and I will be making a video about it at another time, I promise, but I think that the willingness to give you an expectation of how to play your game and then pull it out from under you, that can be really effective if done well. Not every FF or FE game does this, and they don't need to. But in a game like Engage, where they make huge changes to the status quo and then spend several cutscenes winding every character around until they can reach a point where you can preserve your gameplay loop, it is so clearly begging to have a real upset. Like, I don't know, like, imagine if Alear was gone for a few chapters and Vale had to be the main character, or you were corrupted Alear for a few chapters and the Somniel's chill vibes were offset by the silent, grim Fel emblems. Imagine if a character in your team was even just a little bit of a jerk. Wait, what's this title doing? So there's something that has kind of rubbed me in a weird way about Engage, and it's something that kind of blindsided me because it's been a problem for a little while, or at least it was a problem in Three Houses and I just didn't notice. But everyone likes you in these games. And I'm not just bothered by this because I find people going out of their way to tell me how much they like me distressing because I'm one misread social encounter away from ruining my relationship with anyone, but it is a weird way to construct a game. See, I could kind of forgive it, or at least remain kind of ignorant of it within Three Houses because you're everyone's teacher, and kids can, and often do, act like little weirdos around their teacher, speaking as that one kid that was a little weirdo to her teachers constantly at every step of her education, yeah. But the other thing that Three Houses does to mitigate this feeling is that as the story progresses, the students and other teachers become more and more involved in the unwinding story we're going through, and less kind of just jazzed to be in your weird, silent presence. They reach part 2 witnessing and participating in the unraveling and reforming of their world as they know it, and that has some effect on them. In contrast, Engage's desire to step back from the social sim parts of Three Houses means that only a select few characters per chapter will say anything about the story in the Somniel at all, and most will never grow past just kind of being in awe around you. It's so weird. Other than Clan and Fram's absolute devotion to you, the entire cast is just shocked and in pure reverent awe to be around you, and it feels like you never really get to be around any of them earnestly. Alear's most common desire in their support combos is a simple wish to be treated like a normal person, and all of these conversations result in a stilted, awkward dynamic. No one can stop loving you in Engage, and it gets stifling, not just because conflict barely exists between the non-god cast, like Diamant and Ivy are pretty chill with each other considering an entire history of conflict between their respective, nations, but because each character on their own is so nice, and so soft and gently portrayed, it's just kind of a letdown. Like, the most controversial party member, Vale, has a literal alter ego personality put into her to make all of the bad things she did the responsibility of evil Vale, so that Vale, when she overcomes her evil personality, can join your army as someone who feels penitent over her evil self's actions, but has also not done anything, consciously wrong. Could you imagine how interesting it would be if that wasn't the case, and Vale had no sinister alter ego, and it was a trap to lure Alear in and steal the rings, and at the end of it all, once her father gets all 12, she's abandoned, utterly unneeded, and realizes the thing she's fought for was just a lie this entire time, and then you and her have this unsteady, contentious alliance, and as siblings getting to know each other for real, they start to bond, and it's messy, and it's complicated, but that runs the risk of being too interesting. I mean, hell, of all the 4 hounds to join your team, they picked the one that has just been utterly uninteresting, clearly the good guy with no clear reason why he's sticking with them in the first place. They didn't even give us Marnie. Imagine how interesting it would be if Mavier died and Marnie joined your army and she was still kind of a selfish weirdo and a jerk, but she learned how to have, a healthier relationship with people. There are so many simple, easily adaptable things in Engage that they've either left on the table or hastily written and resolved in the span of one chapter, and the overwhelming effect is a game that seems too afraid to do anything to you. There are so many simple, easily adapted things that Engage has either left on the table or has hastily written and resolved in the span of one chapter that the overwhelming effect is a game that seems too afraid to do anything to you. It has good mechanics, but they're built around a story that can't suffer to burden you with anything truly meaningful, so you're left in your chill vibes zone, surrounded by characters who love you, and the symbols of games gone by quietly reaffirming how divinely good you are. It cannot structure itself properly, it cannot give its cast real depth, and it cannot hurt you in the way that it wants to. There is nothing genuinely artistically special about Fire Emblem for the GBA. Blazing Blade is, looking back on it, a perfectly competent story, some of the most stable and gentle gameplay in the series. There really isn't something so unique and profound to this little game for an ancient console that separates it from the most current iteration of the series. I could be mired in my own nostalgia of it, but there are many, many titles in Fire Emblem that have a sense of how to take your hand and guide you through their stories. And reflecting on this, on how I felt when Erika gave the Stone of Renee to Leon, watching Raisin heal Rajon so he could die in Ina's arms, the horrible pit in my stomach as I fought Ike in that miserable little fort with what felt like an army of freshly born antelope, the raw agony of crawling through the Manster arc in Thracia. Like, these games aren't masterpieces, but I feel left out in Engage. I like the game. I like the gameplay. I still get warm, fuzzy feelings when I see Roy, like everyone else does. I even like the cast on a basic level. They're fun and vibrant and colorful and pleasant, but the promise, what I wanted from Engage, didn't happen. I wanted that campy, non-serious, but competently told story. I wanted to get to the end of it like I was in Awakening, feeling like the story wasn't the most thoughtful, complicated tale, but it was heartfelt and carried itself earnestly and well, and I got a little tug on the heartstrings watching Robin sacrifice their life at the end, and the army hoping against hope that they can meet again by some miracle. It isn't that hard to do this, and for Engage to just not care as much in such a specific way hurts more than the years of Three Houses discourse has aged me. If the point was to ease off on the complex political dramas, Engage did it in the laziest way possible. Its style and tone may not be indicative of the series' future, but its worst writing habits haven't changed in almost 10 years, and the way the fandom seems to not care about this, maybe it never will. Special thanks to Alexi Angelica, Caitlin Fisher, Colleen T, Dector A, the VL Durov Center for Psychical Research in Clown College, Lewis Wells, Lorez, Maria Aladren, Mozzie VT, Natalie C. Slane, Nurai the Redmarked, Nomadic Raven, Professor Bopper, Rach, Saint Rawberry, Thomas Volpez, and Zetetic. Thank you all so much.